Professor Ederson Delos Trino Tapia has an extensive academic background which comprises an international master in regional integration degree from the Asia-Europe Institute, University of Malaya, where he graduated with distinction, an internship in special studies at King's College London, a Doctor of Public Administration degree from the University of the Philippines and CPAG, a Master's in Philippine Studies from the UP Asian Center, and a Bachelor's in Political Science from the University of Santo Tomas. He also attended special courses in local governance at the National Institute for Development Administration in Bangkok and leadership studies at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. Priorly, he served as the university's Vice President for Planning and Research and Dean of the College of Governance and Public Policy. His academic career includes his roles as a fellow and faculty member at the Development Academy of the Philippines, Graduate School for Public and Development Management, and a professorial lecturer at UP and CPAG. He is currently the president of the Philippine Society for Public Administration, a member of the Technical Panel in Public Administration of CHED representing the academe, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Philippine Councilors League Legislative Academy. Professor Tapia is also a commissioned officer of the Armed Forces of the Philippines holding the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the Philippine Army. His presentation is entitled Reimagining Public Administration in Disruptive Times, Pedagogical Shifts, Epistemological Pluralism, and Moving Beyond Efficiency. Please join me in welcoming the 2024 Aquilino Pimentel Jr. Professorial Chair Awardee in Governance, Professor Ederson Delos Trino Tapia.
There is an advantage to doing things in your home base because your audience would have no choice but to upload you. So can we start that now? Thank you very much. But to be honest with you, I was trembling in fear when I realized that I'd be delivering the Professorial Chair in Governance today for several reasons. Number one, I got the order from Associate Dean Tabahen yesterday that we would be wearing Filipiniana and barong. No? That's the reason why Dr. Madrona and Dr. Mangaba are wearing Filipiniana right now. And I had to do my part and follow strictly. Why is that scary for me? It became even more scarier, if you will, when I listened to the introduction of Dr. Browner earlier and the introduction of Dean Pimentel. You mix them all together, nakabarong ka, and then you listen to introduction, ano ang conclusion mo, no? Para mamaya may isa-serve daw na kape at saka biscuit. Patay na tayo pare-pareho dyan. So, that's the reason why I'm trembling in fear. But I'm really excited to share with you this presentation this morning for several reasons, no? Number one, it's kinda nostalgic for me, if you will, and emotional that I'm able to receive the Aquilino Pimentel Chair in Governance after having been given the privilege of working with Nene Pimentel after his stint in the Senate. But I'm also glad to acknowledge the students of the Doctor of Public Administration program in the university kasi I know that I am in the midst of kindred spirits. So, my presentation sort of departs a little bit from the excellent presentation of Attorney Madrona in the sense that I want us to look at the discipline of public administration from a macro level, to a certain extent, even distant perspective. Diba? Distance to a certain extent gives you some kind of privilege at looking at things at the whole picture instead of looking at the nooks and crannies and details of a particular phenomena. And that is deliberate on my part. So I'd like to begin by giving honor to Tatay, to Nene Pimentel. He was, I'm sure we're all familiar that he was Senate President, he was Interior Secretary, he was Mayor of the City of Cagayan de Oro, and he was a Law Dean. But most importantly, I think, for our institution, he was Distinguished Professor of Governance after his retirement in the Senate in 2010. And most of us had the opportunity to work with him, and we call him Tatay. So I'm very thankful that um, I would be sort of honoring Tatay with this Professorial Chair Award. Incidentally, the awardee, the first awardee of the Pimentel Chair in 2023 was Alex Brillantes, who was my dissertation advisor in UP. So, uh, again, thankful about that. So let me go on to the core of my presentation. If at any point during my presentation you feel like sleeping, please feel free to do so. This is courtesy of the City Government of Makati. Attorney Jewel, thank you very much for making sure that the aircon is working properly. And pag makita ko inaatlo kayo, I will certainly speak in a more softer voice so that I don't get to disturb you. Anyway, so I come from the field of public administration. Dean Pimentel earlier said that I'm president of the Philippine Society for Public Administration. She is a member of the board. And we know public administration, and many of us don't know about it. So we both know it and we don't know it. Why do I say that? Many of us, in fact, I think all of us in the room are working in government. Tama? We get our GSIs, etc., etc. So that, in a sense, gives us some knowledge of how public administration works. But not all of us are initiated in the discipline of public administration. Some of us are in education, some of us are in business, etc. So, I'll be talking about something that is familiar and yet not so familiar with many of you. As a discipline, public administration is young. Now, it's a social science discipline, but if you compare it with the more established traditions of the social sciences like sociology, like history, like political science, public administration is an infant. It's about 138 years old if you trace it from the seminal article of Wilson that was written in 1887 about his call for the establishment of a science of administration. And it's even younger in the context of the Philippines because if you look at its establishment on the basis of the creation of the Institute of Public Administration, which is now known as NCPAG, where Ver and I teach, it's just 73 years old. By disciplinary standards, that is young. Okay? Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that public administration seems to be in a period of trying to get to know itself. It grapples with some sort of insecurity. It wants to establish itself as a legitimate discipline. Okay? And the story of public administration is perhaps similar to the story of many academic disciplines. What is that? How do you gain currency? How do you gain recognition as an academic discipline? You worship at the altar of science. That is why politics has nothing to do with being scientific, and yet political science still calls themselves a science. Okay? And that is essentially what public administration grappled with and is still continuing to struggle with. And yet, even if it is considerably young, it has a rich provenance. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that that I would be making references to in the course of my presentation. Now, perhaps owing to this infancy, public administration is not very much well defined. It has rough edges, shifting corners, and shifting core, rough edges, and sharp corners. In other words, if you make me draw how public administration looks like, I wouldn't be able to know it because it's fleeting. No? Again, this is compared to more established disciplines with their theoretical toolkits and what have you. Public administration does not have that. So, for those many of you taking up comprehensive examination, one of the things that I tell you is you should have at least 10 different definitions of what public administration is. Diba? Unlike, for example, biology. Biology is the study of life. Wala na tayong pag-uusapan doon. But public administration has many different perspectives and definitions, and they can't seem to agree with each other. Perhaps because of the nature of the discipline as a young one. And you also have to compound it further by the realities of the discipline. For example, can you actually conduct a chemical experiment without making references to the external environment? Perhaps you can, diba? You just combine elements and then do your experiment in Makati, Milan, and the results would be the same. That does not hold true for the social sciences, particularly in public administration. Why? Because we are an applied field. The fact that we are an applied field means that reality, as reality changes, the theories that we use also evolve. And Stillman, in fact, calls public administration as the eminently practical science. So what does this mean in practical terms? Public administration is multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. I've asked our colleagues to time me because that's the main problem with old academics like me. We tend to talk too much. So please tell me if I'm going uh, over time. So given all of these characteristics of public administration as a discipline, the question now is, what is the implication to teaching? How do we make sense of all of this in our delivery of public administration programs? Before moving any further, I'd like us to look at the terrain. No? How does the field look like? Earlier, I was introduced by Dean Sonia as a member of the Reserve Force. I'm glad to welcome my commander, Colonel Ga is here. Also, my commander in the National Capital Region uh, group of the Reserve Command of the Philippines. He's also a TPA student about to take his dissertation writing. And one of the things that we learn in the Army is that you have to understand the terrain. And that's also what we want to do in the case of public administration. I tell you that the terrain by which public administration navigates is not unique to it. It is perhaps also something that you can relate with in your respective fields. Technological advancements are aplenty. We are witnessing the unprecedented presence of artificial intelligence in our lives. Industry 4.0, and I think in my conversations with Din Berganya, this has in fact been overtaken by Industry 5.0. Globalization is kind of, in fact, as an old argument. One of the first things that I started to sort of understand as an undergraduate student was that we are facing a globalizing world. But that is still true up to today. And of course, VUCA is now part of our vocabulary and lexicon. Incidentally, as you very well know, VUCA emanated from the U.S. Army War College. It's been abrogated by academics such as Bennett and Lemoyne, and it's now part of many management principles and the Anthropocene. Just a few days ago, we were um, visited by a rather strong typhoon. Ano ba pangalan nun? Juan, and then just previously, Ino in Cebu. So we call these acts of God, but in reality, the effects of these weather disturbances are mainly caused by human intervention. Look at Cebu, Salitariang is under fire for the development that was done in the Monterrasas area, but it's something that affects public administration as a discipline as well. And going back to my roots in political science, this populist surge and the assault on the bureaucracy. You go to many DPWH or regional offices, they're highly secured and fortified now. Bakit? Natatakot sila, baka atakihin sila ng mga tao. Pag pansinin niyo yung mga Facebook account natin, hindi na nagpo-post ng mga travel yung mga government officials. No? Sometimes it's because of the events that are happening around us that would perhaps also explain this so-called assault on the bureaucracy. But you will agree with me that not everybody in government is corrupt. Especially the University of Makati, wala naman tayong ikukorrupt dito, di ba? So, but there is this assault in the bureaucracy, both here in the Philippines and abroad. And the most symbolic picture of this would be Elon Musk brandishing his, ano ba tawag doon? His chainsaw for the rest of the world to see in his attempt to reduce government personnel in the United States. What's happening in the United States now, which is why I refuse to go there? Government shutdown. Flights are delayed and are also exposed to danger. So there's this obvious assault on the bureaucracy. Is that good? Is that good or is that bad? I don't know. We'll try to explore later. So, as a discipline, public administration was established with a very narrow focus. Earlier, I said that public administration worshipped in the altar of science. Okay? And their deity and their god was efficiency. So that was the primordial consideration for the establishment of public administration. And guess what? That has not changed that much from 1887 up to today. How do I prove that? One of the requirements that di naman si Attorney Joel ang may kasalanan nun, but the civil service requires us to submit is this document called Individual Performance, ano ba tawag doon? IPCR. Where you attempt to measure your performance to precisely quantitative terms. I tell you, is that even possible to do? So the reality is, nagkokopyahan na lang. Diba? Why? Because of our attempt to worship at the altar of science using efficiency as our God. No? So hindi masyadong nagbago from that. Now, the question is it time for us to abandon the efficiency as the end-all and be-all of all public administration studies or public administration attempts to discover knowledge? That's what we would like to answer for the duration of this presentation. So, my talk would be talking about things that are old and new. Okay? Some of the things that I would be discussing, and when I say old, I'm not talking about Dean Ombro. I'm talking about concepts that are not really new to us, no? And yet, we're also going to talk about how they've metamorphosed into what they are now. So, and I think that's a way of our attempt to describe the trajectory by which the discipline is taking root and taking shape. There are four, no? There are four trajectories that I'd like us to focus on. Number one is what we call pedagogical shifts. I'll talk about it in detail later. Second is Norma Ricucci in 2010 earlier described as epistemological pluralism. Number three is the Minnowbrook legacy. And number four, which is just really something that is perhaps more resonant for Filipinos like us, would be the question on regulation. Okay, thank you. So, the agenda for this presentation is basically twofold. The first one is to make a contribution to the theoretical understanding of public administration as it is taught in universities and it is practiced in many government institutions. And the second one is to suggest practical toolkits for practitioners in the field to use. So those are the two broad objectives of this presentation and the paper that I wrote for the Aquilino Pimentel Chair Award. So what do we mean when we talk about pedagogical shifts? I was given the privilege of being identified with a surname that certain people of a certain generation are familiar with, si Miss Tapia. No? So, if you're a person who was born in that particular age, you can easily picture what I'm talking about. No? Teacher, papasok sa classroom, may dalang stick, etc. Galit pa, pag hindi nakapag-prepare. No? For the longest time, our academic disciplines were like that, public administration included. Hindi na pwede yun ngayon, as you very well know. So we're looking at major shifts in the discipline of in the teaching of public administration from the time of Ms. Tapia to the time of Mr. Tapia. So, what do we mean by this? These are not really new. Yung mga teacher-centered techniques, I've heard Dr. Browner and Professor Lopez spoke about this in great detail in the past. So these are not really new. But perhaps what we are observing would be the mainstreaming of these modalities and perhaps the expansion of these techniques to a very large extent. Okay? Another one would be the use of case studies, simulations, and problem-based learning. Of course, Dean Bergania would say, di naman nabago yan. We've been teaching that in the College of Education for the longest time. Yes, but it's now becoming more mainstream, and if it is not, it should be. Again, we go to the question of why. Because public administration is an applied field. It's impossible for you to understand public administration without doing field work. Impossible. Unlike philosophy, for example, Granti would be talking to himself and he could develop a theory or a framework. That's possible. Diba? Public administration does not work that way precisely because of its applied nature, its multidisciplinary nature, and its interdisciplinarity. What other pedagogical shifts are we looking at? Well, simulations of real-world situations. You know, sinasabi natin, ginagawa naman natin to, no? But only because we're required to do it. What we are saying now is it should be in the centerpiece of the kind of teaching that we do in public administration courses. Why? Because when disaster strikes, you don't go to your book and consult what the theories say. You actually do it. And it's always different for you to be thinking about these things and actually feeling it. Diba? So, it's important that public administration makes use of these tools more and more and in a dedicated manner. And again, privileged to have been mentored by Professor Lopez, that we in the University of Makati started doing this way back in 2010. Ngayon, siyempre, ginasabi na nila yan, reality-based. Ano yun, yung mga micro-credentials. Guess what? We've been doing that for the longest time. But it's now being mainstreamed and we're happy about that. But the fact of the matter is, we have first mover advantage. Dahil nauna na tayo dyan, hindi pa uso yan sa literature. Gamification. I'm writing a paper about how gamification is being used as a pedagogical tool, and it's perhaps interesting how we can do an experiment in gamification in not only in public administration courses, but perhaps even in political science and other fields. No? Good thing is, there are other universities that have already been doing this. Now, one is the University of the Sunshine Coast, who's doing SIM. Again, yung mga kaedad ko, you're familiar with SIM, di ba? Yung SIM City. It's an attempt to approximate urban planning, etc. They're doing that as a pedagogical tool, hindi na lang laro. What else? Well, the Maxwell schools doing emergency response using sophisticated modeling techniques that require the students to be approximating disasters in their workplace. And of course, there are a lot of benefits to this. No? The education experts know better than me with respect to how experiential student-centered learning offers a lot of benefits to students. Okay, digital learning. The people who just came from Australia received their micro-credential certificates from APEC. And guess what? That can lead to a degree if we want to pursue it. Again, ngayon, medyo uso na yan, but in the past, we were already doing it in the University of Makati. No? So digital learning, there's a nice program. Ang ganda rin ang motto nila, yung public leadership credential at Harvard, sabi nila doon, 100% online, 100% Harvard. So you can actually make the claim of being an alumnus of Harvard University simply by taking that course. And several other examples, including the UP Open University, perhaps in less visible mechanism, but they've been doing that. And what it does is that it increases accessibility, inclusivity, and flexibility in the way education is delivered to the people. And don't get me started on artificial intelligence because it's something that is in our midst. Pag tatanungin ko kayo, sino ba dito ang hindi gumagamit ng AI? It's either sinungaling yun or kasing edad ni Enrile. But that's not even an excuse. The reality is, AI is in our midst. You use Grammarly? That's AI. You use techniques of correcting your papers by the use of certain technological instruments. That's also AI. Diba? Facebook is even AI. The real question now is how do you come up with modalities to create a more ethical system for the use of AI in your life and in our work as academics, no? And just recently, I think just a couple of days ago, the Asian Institute of Management launched a master's program on AI and cybersecurity. UP now has a program dedicated to understanding the doctoral program, a PhD in artificial intelligence. So tell me it's not something that we have to be serious about. Okay? Again, real question, real challenge is the ethics behind the use of AI. And again, ito yung alternative assessment mechanisms na medyo hindi na to purple cow sa UMAC because we've been doing this for the longest time. And you know, as you can perhaps imagine, the government is a little bit about behind by about 10 years when it comes to mainstreaming these alternative assessment tools. Noon, ang tagal na namin to pinag-usapan ni Professor Lopez, no? And when we started our programs at the CGPP, siyempre, daming ko, ano, nagalit and hindi naniwala, etc., etc. Guess what? It's been normalized now. Micro-credential, Coursera, etc. But we had first mover advantage when it was not yet a fad. Kaya noon, it was being frowned upon as sacrificing rigor, now rigorous na. Exact same thing, ha? Kind of problematic if you ask me, but that's how it is. Okay, so those are the shifts in pedagogy. Obviously, maraming nakikita tayong pagbabago. And Jason, in fact, wrote a dissertation on what he calls digital literacy. And people are looking at more infusion of technology in the way they understand things and they create knowledge. So there's no debate about these shifts in pedagogy that we are witnessing. And if you are still in the era of Miss Tapia, when you should be doing Mr. Tapia right now, there's something problematic about your teaching methodology. Now let's go to epistemological pluralism. I'm so glad that some of the respected professors of the graduate school are here because I'm going to talk about something that is happening in many graduate schools across the country. I said earlier that public administration started as a discipline that used science as its altar and had efficiency as its deity. DEIDY. Yun just an public administration, no? Yun just niya. Okay. And, and worshipping in the altar of science would most definitely also include with it making use of the religion of positivism. And because of the fact that public administration also had that kind of insecurity, it wanted to gain currency by the very same tools of positivism. In other words, the kind of methodological tool that was used from the get-go, from 1887 onwards, were all quantitative in nature. Why? Because that is the only way you gain respectability as a science. Don't tell me you're going to do ethnography, you're going to do that, because they will all be rejected and reduced as unscientific. And public administration also had to grapple with that challenge. So, from 1887 until now, would you believe that this is still happening? You try to talk to many graduate school professors in the country, and you tell them that your methodology would be doing an ethnography or perhaps doing an investigation on the lived experiences. And the first thing that you get would be, that's not scientific. It will not be accepted by your dissertation committee. Yes, we teach in the methods of research that there are a lot of mixed methods that are at your disposal, reflexive methods, etc., etc. But just do a bibliometric analysis of articles that are published in academic journals, and you would be surprised that a lot of them, a great majority of them, in the field of public administration, are still quantitative in nature. I've had the opportunity to talk to James Perry when we were in Washington, D.C. And when he was editor of the Public Administration Review, the leading public administration journal in the US and the world, if you will, he only accepted articles that were making use of quantitative methods. Why? Because that gave them precision and the ability to measure knowledge creation. No? Is that even still relevant now? No? Unfortunately, the debate remains with the with the proponents of the quantitative methods still getting the upper hand. So when I wrote my dissertation, my advisor, Dr. Brillantes, is also a bit averse to quantitative methods, thankfully, and so we had to agree with each other. But the quantitative methods did not escape me because I had to do mixed. Otherwise, my dissertation would not have been acceptable to the doctoral panel in UP. Okay, so that is still true, and that's one of the things that I am worried about, and I keep on guarding. So there's no question about these epistemological conflicts. Nag-aaway pa rin yung mga reflectivists at saka mga positivists. The question now is, ano yung dapat natin gawin? What do we do? Pag-awayin natin lalo, or, in some economics professional societies abroad, they don't even attend the same conferences. Bakit? Because one looks down on the other, simply on the basis of their epistemological predispositions. It's not as bad as in our case, no, because we're more fluid that way. But I think in order for us to move beyond this epistemological impasse, what I am proposing is the use of Norma Ricucci's framework in 2010, which she calls epistemological pluralism. Sabi ni Mao, let 100 flowers bloom. There should be no privileging of one specific epistemological or methodological tool over the other. Because again, going back to the fact that public administration is an applied field, reality is never singular plane. You'd have to look at it from different vantage points and different methods. And because of that, you need a pluralistic set of methodological tools. Okay, so that is what I am proposing. And it is, according to Ricucci, Janswood, and Prader, and several other authors, what this tells us is that there's no singular viewpoint or approach that entirely can encapsulate or approximate how reality happens on the ground. Academic disciplines are therefore administrative convenience more than anything else. But it does not really help you understand reality completely. Okay? So, what does this mean in practical terms? When we teach, when we do research, we integrate diverse knowledge. Kaya yung ating vertical articulation, it's something that we have to revisit. Why can't an engineer teach in public administration, for example? Why can't a nurse do that? Why can't a medical professional do that? We saw COVID. Ano ba ang COVID? Is it a medical concern? Why was the person in charge of COVID response not a medical person at all? Because it is not only a medical issue. It's a governance issue. In fact, the first sectors who made interventions in COVID response, I'm happy to say, was the military. Di ba? So, the problems of governance cannot be contained using a single sector or a single disciplinary approach. Okay? We also have to adopt multiple methodologies. Huwag na tayong mag-insist on quasi-experiments. Palagi. Because that's one method. That's not the entire method. And hindi como you're doing qualitative methods, you're of a lesser scientific value. That's not true. Diba? So let's abandon that kind of thinking. And we have to appreciate practitioner knowledge. Unfortunately, again, and I'm going to go back to this later, we don't really make heavy use of practitioner knowledge that much in the Philippines. Okay, anong uso ngayon? Napag-uusapan by EDCOM. Madami daw diploma field ng PhD in education. That is true. But we cannot blame the schools alone. The question is, why did they proliferate in the first place? Kasi ni-require ninyo mag-masters pati yung teacher ng nursery. Di ba? You cannot get promoted unless you have a PhD in Ano ba yung administration and supervision? Wala namang ina-administer, wala rin sinusupervise. So it's something that would require a holistic approach, not just knee-jerk reaction na, diploma mill, etc., etc. You get my point? So that's something that we have to look at too. Practitioner knowledge is important. Dito sa UMAC, you cannot get full professor unless you have a PhD. Di ba? But there are many among us in our midst who are excellent at what they do. This is our problem with Dean concept noon. Di mabigyan ng mataas na rank dahil kung ano-ano daw, etc., etc. But there's no question about your background and experience. We don't leverage practitioner knowledge that much. And I'm talking about it at an institutional level, not only here in UMAC, but perhaps in the whole country. Next would be consideration of cultural perspectives. When we do research, you know that there are certain practices that are unique to certain areas. And we have to be cognizant of that. Okay, there are many lawyers here, Attorney Jewel, Attorney Madrona, and several others. But we know that when we, for example, look at land titles, they have a unique way if you're dealing with the IPRA, with the indigenous peoples, diba? And that's something that you have to integrate. Okay, what else? Interdisciplinary collaboration. And we're very happy when there's interdisciplinary collaboration. Kaya, I remember VPNet when we went to Chris O'Brien, they did mention that they work on teams, pharmacy students who work with people who have no idea about pharmacy, engineers, etc., etc. Because that's the beauty of um, interdisciplinary collaboration. Yung kaninang reflexivity, binanggit ko rin, so I'll just move forward. So, hindi naman to, again, hindi naman tayo lang ang nag-isip nito. There are also guideposts that we can look at. The University of California in Berkeley is making use of this in the area of environmental governance. Just a few days ago, I think I saw in one of the posts in Facebook a treatise about politicizing environmental governance in a good way. Okay? So, they're doing that. And while kami sa NCPAG, we're doing, well, we have a GIS program and programs that you would think are not within the traditional domain of public administration. So, the benefit is that you have holistic problem solving and well-rounded governance perspectives. Incidentally, all of the things that I'm saying are available in a paper that would hopefully, crossing fingers, would be published soon and would be made available to everybody. Okay, I have 5 minutes according to April, so we'll move on. When I talk about epistemological pluralism, it does not mean that we have to abandon rigor. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is that there has to be a more dedicated way at looking at different sets of methodological tools. Hindi single lang, hindi singular lang, no? And in fact, this is more challenging kasi you have to be more sophisticated in your methods. Okay? Just a caveat, just as a warning. Kasi baka naman sabihin, which is my problem with postmodernism really, is that everything is okay. No, not everything is okay. Alright? So yan yung caveat natin tungkol sa epistemological pluralism. So we've gone through pedagogical shifts, we've gone through epistemological pluralism. Now let's move on to the Minnowbrook legacy. Yung mga magko-compre, you have to know Minnowbrook, ha? Dahil, syempre pag di nyo alam yan, minus na kayo agad sa compre. Minnowbrook is a very, I think it's a pivotal movement in the discipline of public administration because in 1968, a group of academics, young ones in their revolutionary 20s, gathered in a place in Ithaca, New York. Was it in Ithaca or somewhere else? But somewhere in upstate New York, asking a very simple question. How relevant is the discipline of public administration? So, di ba, sometimes we take stock like, I've been in the University of Makati for the last 25 years. Have I made any meaningful contribution at all? I don't know if you do that, but perhaps it's something that we should do from time to time, di ba? Taking stock. And public administration did that in 1968. And you know what? What did they realize? Then, that public administration has not been responsive to the demands of the time. Why? Because they were too focused into the demands of efficiency. which they found problematic. Okay, give you an example. Halimbawa, merong bibigay na ayuda para sa lahat. You think it is logical to give everybody in the country the very same set of ayuda? That's efficient, that's equal, but that's not necessarily equitable. And public administration, according to Minnowbrook in 1968, states that when you talk about governance programs, you only don't talk about equality. You talk about equity, you talk about being equitable in your functions, and you talk about emancipation. And that is the gift of Minnowbrook. They've done Minnowbrook conferences every 20 years, and I'm threatening my colleagues in the department that I would be attending the uh, Minnowbrook Conference come 2028 kasi they do it nga every 20 years. And so, the discipline of public administration was reconfigured. Instead of just worshipping at the altar of efficiency, they included several other more normative goals, and that is equity, responsibility, and ethical governance. Okay? And that is something that we agree with. That's something that we agree with. So, again, what does this mean in practical terms? What it means in practical terms is that public administration would not only be guided by traditional management tools that have no regard for context. Okay? You would have regard, for example, to the needs of the gender, DEI. If you go by traditional public administration strategies alone, these are irrelevant because recipients of government service are the same, but they're not the same. They're not the same. They have qualitatively different situations, and the response should also be qualitatively different. Okay, one thing that I'm running out of time, but just one thing that I'd like us to talk about a little bit would be the role of the Anthropocene. Again, sinabi ko na kanina, the Anthropocene talks about effects on the planet made by humans. And don't tell me that the effects of Tino in the southern part of the Philippines are purely acts of God. In fact, sa insurance, inalis na nila yung acts of God na yan eh. Acts of nature na eh. Dahil baka daw magalit yung Diyos. Ako bang gumawa niyan? Diba? So, we have tremendous effects on the environment. Eh. And this is something that should also inform the way we conduct our research and we do our teaching of public administration. I'm going to rush na dahil 1 minute na lang daw ako according to April. So, if you look at all of these things, ang sarap pag-usapan, di ba? When we talk about it, I know that when you ask your questions, marami sa inyo mga highly opinionated and perhaps would create some livid conversations later. But the real problem in our context would be the regulatory framework. Ito na naman tayo. Ang ganda ng mga pinagsasabi mo, is it anything close to the reality of how we teach public administration in the Philippines? I hope I had a better answer to you that I don't really know. And that is something that comes from a member of the technical panel of public administration. Diba? What do I mean by that? We have to ask ourselves a difficult question. Yung mga pinagsasabi mo, yung mga rough edges, mga sharp corners, mga etc. na yan, how does it find its way into the curricular offering of public administration mismo? I tell you, in general terms, wala. There's an obvious disconnect between our investigation of the terrain and what actually happens on the ground, on the regulatory requirements by the regulators. Diba? And that is something that is problematic. How should the PSGs integrate PA's character as an eminently practical science? Nakalista ka yung mga subject dun eh, and single departure would merit a disapproval from the regulatory body. Parang it does not fit. Diba? So, how do we address that? How do we address interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity in the field? We still want vertical articulation. Hindi pwedeng mag-hire ng engineer sa public administration departments kasi hindi aligned. Get my point? So, again, the real question is how we integrate all of this in the way we deliver public administration education and the way we teach public administration courses and in the manner that we practice public administration both at the national and at the local level. So I think that's all for me, and I hope I contributed to your confusion about the things that we're talking about, and we hope to get questions from you later. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Attorney. We now proceed to the question of Dr. Vergania.
This question is addressed to the modern day Tapia. Kasi hindi rin siya magiging happy kung wala magtatanong sa kanya. You have clearly defined, crystal clear, how PA is so fluid transdisciplinarily. Now, do you see the possibility of PA to be a staple program that can be taken by those who are in or aspiring to be in the administrative role or supervisory role across disciplines? Like for example, I might be a dean of education but I am PA in background. Will that be a possibility in the future?
Ganda idea yun No, but seriously, I think there were similar proposals in the past, particularly those who are occupying elected positions, no? Pero political science or public administration naman. On the one hand, it's so tempting for us to sort of require anybody who's working in government to have at least a modicum of education in the field of public administration. That would be ideal, but also in the same manner that it would be counterproductive, I think, if we make it a requirement. No? So again, I think the problem mainly in government is that we think too much of regulatory measures that we sort of impose on the people, but it my perhaps what I'm saying is we can suggest, we can perhaps create a more enabling environment to facilitate those who might be interested to take public administration, even if they're not necessarily administering programs in that particular field. Okay? We can encourage that. And in fact, I think it would be very useful. However, for us to make it a requirement is something that we have to sort of think about. Okay? And we've seen this. You're a dean, and many of us here are administrators. We know how difficult it is to navigate, for example, budgetary processes. Diba? Nung araw kasi hindi natin ginagawa yan. Pero ngayon, you have to defend budget, you have to understand what's the difference between an AIP and a PPMP, and when does budget approval takes place, and you know what you need to do for bidding, etc., etc. Those are all, the toolkits to learn those things are all available to public administration practitioners and teach those who are teaching public administration. So one way or the other, I think Dean Jason, perhaps the idea is for us to inject more public administration lessons in to be taken by those who are not administering public administration programs. To a certain extent, we do that Kaya lang not in a deliberate manner. Like, okay, may mga bagong sa Congress, meron silang newly elected officials. So, nagtitake sila nung, in fact, it's NCPAG that does that. Yung newly elected officials orientation, I taught in some of those. And yun yung mga ganun, no? So, I think it's a good idea kasi it would also be very practical. Lalo-lalo na, and this is something that we've all tangled with City Hall for the longest time. And ako sabi ko, don't expect the deans to perhaps understand the difference between an AIP and a PPMP. Pakialam nila dyan mga yan PhD yan, psychology. No, but perhaps to be a better administrator, mas maganda siguro kung mas naiintindihan mo yung terrain na nina-navigate mo.
Other questions?
Pwede pa. Okay, I would like to navigate my question to, kasi kanina I was actually hesitant to ask this question because I might be off tangent. Because you are talking about public governance, and here I am representing education. I was drawn to, of the four prongs you mentioned a while ago, you mentioned about epistemological pluralism, which I am very much interested since I'm teaching research. most of the students are limited by academic conveniences, protracted timelines, which actually prevent my student to really explore on the topic. Now, maybe the limitation is on the part of the instructional, maybe on the instructional idea of limiting whatever things they would have to think of on the protracted timelines to finish a degree. And this is actually limiting the students. I know they have potential to really work on something like case studies, but dapat matapos ako ma'am ng degree ko at the end of certain time. So therefore, since Dr. Tapia is with the graduate school of the CCAP, so I would like also to bring this up. How we could help a graduate student from extending further and realizing maybe on our part as advisors would like to explore on the fact that student can navigate towards the end of whatever terrain they want to pursue. So could you actually provide us a leeway into which the student will be able to recognize such dream that they want to attain without limitations on the pluralism that we want to inject in our students?
Thank you very much for your question, ma'am. But the short answer to the question is obviously yes. No, we've been very open to accepting varied approaches, except that perhaps I think as a function of getting used to this kind of
Yes.
things, many of the students in the graduate school are already on automatic mode that when they do dissertation writing or thesis writing, they do quasi experiment.
Yeah.
They do survey, But insofar as the internal regulatory measures in the college are concerned, there's no limitation on the conduct of
Yeah.
or the assumed epistemological stance
Yes.
of a student. However, I would admit that there are certain constraints with respect to timelines.
Yes.
And it has to do also with the way we structure graduate programs in the Philippines.
Yeah.
It's good that we're now lessening at the PhD level, especially. We're lessening the number of contact hours for graduate programs, but we're still not really oriented towards doing a research or the research directed degree. For as far as I know, there's only one university in the Philippines that does that as of yet, and that's LaSalle. I'm talking about our field of the social sciences, no? LaSalle has a good program in political science. They have a PhD in political science, very minimal coursework, and a lot of it has to do with building up your portfolio as an academic via publication, via consultancy, via academic work, via writing, no? But for the most part, talagang American pa rin tayo. We take coursework even
Yes.
at the PhD level. Something that although I did my DPA in UP, it's also very American. Something that I really don't understand. I have been given the privilege of studying in a Commonwealth country, and that's Malaysia and the United Kingdom. And at the PhD level, zero coursework. That gives you more avenue to conduct your research. So that when you enroll at the PhD level, meron ka ng research agenda. Whether you want to do whatever kind of ethnographic research, you want to do lived experiences, you want to do complex kind of multifactorial analysis or whatever, pwede kang may leeway ka. And I know that it's a long shot, but ma'am, in reality, there's also some kind of resistance on the part of private universities. Why? Kasi, I'll tell you, in terms of the number of units, we still measure tuition fees on the basis of the number of units. So yung PhD, there's a proposal sana to completely get away with the number of units or reduce it further, like 12 units lang ang coursework. Ako, ito na yung mga private school. Uy, teka muna. Mawawala kaming enrollees. And so it's still a requirement. But my dream, ma'am, is that sana we can sort of, like, we have si Ver kasi may PhD yan, tapos may DPA din. But I have a DPA from UP. Pero there are applied disciplines that can be that should be taught, not really taught, that should require more practice in the field rather than face-to-face teaching.
Yes.
Yun yung dream natin. And at the PhD level, perhaps do more scholarly work by writing and publishing. And that would also contribute to the aim of almost all universities now towards research, fortifying research presence as an attribute of university ranking.